was dramatic, swift, and brutal. To examine the evidence, we need to revisit the fateful week before the murder of Jesus. Jerusalem, 30 AD. Thousands are pouring into the city to celebrate the festival of Passover. Jesus, a rebel from Galilee, is making a big impact. He enters the city on a donkey, fulfilling ancient prophecies about the arrival of the Messiah. The next day, inside the great temple, Jesus attacks the money changers for defiling the holy place. The high priests of the temple call a secret meeting. They see Jesus as a threat to their power and authority. He must be stopped. The following day, the Romans are alerted. To them, Jesus could be the cause of an uprising against imperial Rome. That night, Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane by temple guards. He is dragged for trial before Caiaphas, the high priest of the temple. And then before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. In less than 24 hours, Jesus is sentenced to death by crucifixion. There are three main suspects for the killing of Jesus, and there is strong evidence against all of them. Suspect number one is Caiaphas, high priest of the Temple of Jerusalem. His fingerprints are everywhere, and he had good reasons to want Jesus dead. Caiaphas was the most powerful high priest in the history of Judea. He was a man of enormous influence right across the life of Jerusalem. He was high priest for 18 years when the average survival time in office was just 4. He also had supreme political skills and a shrewd ability to cooperate successfully with the Romans, the ultimate rulers of Judea. For Helen Bond, Caiaphas is an enigmatic figure. She is researching his life and has studied the power structure of the high priests in the Jerusalem temple and their relations with the Romans.
Caiaphas is a wealthy Jerusalem aristocrat. He comes from a good priestly family and is well connected. He has an enormous amount of prestige in Jerusalem because of his position. He's the high priest in the Jerusalem temple. This puts him at the very top of Judean society.
Although Judea was controlled by the Romans, civil and religious law was in the hands of the Sanhedrin, the supreme council of Jews. It had 71 members, mostly chief priests, and was presided over by the high priest, Caiaphas.
The way the system worked was that the Romans appointed a governor, the governor appointed the high priest, and in this case, Caiaphas and Pilate seem to have had a very cozy relationship. The high priest Caiaphas and the other high priests depended completely on the Roman approval, and to maintain Roman approval, they had to maintain order in the society.
Position and power are precisely what Caiaphas and all the chief priests stood to lose if the people began to follow Jesus. That could lead to unrest, maybe even revolution in Judea. And they stood to lose something else, much more concrete. Archaeology is now showing that even though they were priests of the temple, Caiaphas and his associates lived a life of luxury. James Strange spends much of his professional life studying the evidence for events described in the Gospels. He believes there are good archaeological signs that Caiaphas and the chief priests lived in some style and in the very best part of town.
The houses that have been excavated that help us the most have been found in the old city of Jerusalem, in the Jewish quarter. They were found beneath modern ruined houses which were undergoing renovation.
The workmanship in these ancient houses was of the very finest quality. The people who lived here had money. The interiors were richly decorated with mosaic floors, painted ceilings, and elegant furnishings.
All of this conspires to suggest something about their lifestyle. They have ample room. They live in large rooms, much larger than we expect to find in ancient houses.
As the archaeologists dug beneath the floors of these lavish houses, they made an even more important discovery. They unearthed a ritual bath. It was important for all Jews to use a ritual bath in order to purify themselves before any act of worship. But these houses had so many ritual baths, they could only have belonged to the high priests. This discovery was a clue to something else that Caiaphas stood to lose: a lucrative income. Under Jewish law, most people arriving in Jerusalem for Passover were deemed to be unclean.
That meant that if you had, in the recent past, come into contact with something which creates impurity, like a corpse, or if you had had intercourse with a menstruating woman, it was expected of you to purify yourself.
Before they could enter the temple, everyone had to be ritually clean. Immersion in the water of a ritual bath would ensure purification. The priests had baths strategically placed outside the temple for public use. Everyone, even the poorest, had to pay for these rituals, and they were not cheap. Ronnie Reich has found no fewer than 150 ritual baths around the temple.
This was a sort of mania to add more and more obligations, say for this you have to be pure and for that you have to be pure. And each of this regulation demanded so many more thousands of ritual bathings for the entire public. And for this they had to provide the means for this. And that's the reason why we have so many of these installations.
The baths must have generated considerable income for the priests. But Jesus was teaching that elaborate and expensive purity rituals were unnecessary.
The whole elaborate temporal apparatus was designed to bring revenues in for simple matters like purification, for forgiveness of sins, for incidental sins. And it's clear that this is a major bone of contention that Jesus has with the temple and the high priests. He's declaring that the kingdom of God is available without all those elaborate purification rituals. He is opening the kingdom of God to beggars and sinners and people who can't even afford to pay those rituals and sacrifices, so that people can receive the blessings of God without paying for it through the temple system.
Jesus wasn't only attacking the priest's control over the economy, he was raising the stakes right across the board. In the eyes of Jews everywhere, he was directly challenging the authority of Caiaphas.
Caiaphas had maintained quite a strong control over the religious life of Jews, and not only Jews in Jerusalem, and not only Jews in Judea, but in fact the worldwide Jewish community in this period.
Jesus was by no means the first Jewish rebel to take on Caiaphas. But this time Caiaphas had good reason to worry. Jesus had chosen the most volatile week of the year to make his challenge, Passover, the largest annual festival in the Jewish calendar. Pilgrims came to Jerusalem from all over the world, some from as far away as Babylon and Italy. In front of such huge crowds, Caiaphas could not afford to be humiliated. Although there are no records of the population in Jerusalem during Passover, a revealing yardstick is the number of lambs sacrificed. The first-century historian Josephus says the high priests at one Passover in Jerusalem counted 255,600 lambs killed and eaten for the festival. He calculates one lamb feeds 10 people, so the crowds in Jerusalem that week could have been as great as 2.5 million. Any attack now on the authority of Caiaphas would be devastating.
The chief priests and Caiaphas would have been very worried by Jesus. Any kind of preacher coming to Jerusalem at the crowded time of Passover was a potential threat. They would, I think, have been worried, on one hand, by his authority, the fact that he's getting quite a following amongst the people, the fact that the people are listening to Jesus rather than they themselves. But I think perhaps much more importantly, they'd have been very worried about what Jesus could do to the temple. What if Jesus started some kind of revolt or riot in the temple?
It is likely Jesus was already known to Caiaphas and the high priests. Not much escaped their notice in the holy city. At Passover, they would be tracking his every move. It was an explosive setting for what was to come. In the temple, Jesus made his first move. He accused the money changers and sacrificial dove sellers of extortion and of turning the temple into a den of thieves. But this action was also a powerful symbol. Jesus was saying that God would destroy this temple and all its corruption.
The high priests would have been extremely alarmed to see this demonstration and this trouble happen in the temple courtyard at Passover time. The temple, of course, is the place where the high priests held sway. They were the sacrosanct high priests that carried out the sacrifices on behalf of the whole people. And in their mind, this action of Jesus would simply have been a blasphemy.
It is an act of arrogance. This guy thinks he is somebody, he can just walk into the temple and do things like this. It is an act of insult. It is an act that shows grave dissatisfaction with the way things are. It is done in a very public time.